Your husband, the man who supported you, his funeral is about to begin. You should be the one leading the service to repay him for his kindness. 5 years after divorcing my husband, my MIL, with whom I had no contact, told me to attend my ex-husband's funeral and act as the head mourner. Normally, you wouldn't expect them to ask the ex-wife to come to the funeral. I was struggling with money and thought this was an invitation just to get the condolence money. But something felt off. My ex-husband passed away a year ago, and the funeral should have already been done. After all, I had handed a few $100s to a person who claimed they were collecting the condolence money on behalf of my MIL. A funeral? Not the first-year memorial? Huh? Who in their right mind would do the first-year memorial before the funeral? If you're lying to get out of it, come up with a better excuse. Wait, this conversation isn't making any sense. What on earth is going on? When I told her the name of the person who came to collect the money on her behalf, she was speechless. She said she had something to tell me about that, so I hurried to the designated funeral home. When I arrived, my MIL was in a massive argument with someone. After finding out what the fight was about, another person got absolutely furious. The result was a catastrophic outcome for both my MIL and that person. I married a man I met through a friend when I was 30. 2 months into the marriage, I found out I was pregnant, so we didn't have the typical honeymoon phase, but my in-laws were thrilled about the baby. My relationship with my in-laws wasn't bad, and we were enjoying a happy marriage. But around 3 months after learning about the pregnancy, my husband started becoming distant. No matter what I talked about, he showed no interest, and sometimes he wouldn't even touch the meals I made. Meanwhile, the baby was growing well, and I was just a week away from giving birth. When I tried to talk to him about what to do while I was in the hospital for the delivery, he claimed he was too busy with work to listen. The night before my hospital stay, he said he wouldn't come home because he was staying out. So, I called a taxi by myself and headed to the hospital. My husband had originally refused to be present at the birth, so I had already prepared myself for the fact that he wouldn't rush to the hospital, using work as an excuse. It wasn't a difficult birth, and I was relieved that things went smoother than I had expected, but my husband didn't visit me, not even once, while I was in the hospital. Apparently, he didn't even come to see our newborn son. On the day of my discharge, I thought I'd be handling the paperwork alone again, just like when I was admitted. But my FIL, who had grown suspicious of my husband's absence, rushed over in his car, insisting on driving me home. I was grateful for his thoughtfulness and accepted the ride home. I thought he might be using this as an excuse to give my husband a piece of his mind. Or so I assumed. That's why I invited him in, asking, "Why don't you come inside for a bit?" My FIL hesitated for a moment, but then said it'd be best for us to have some family time, and after dropping me off, he left without coming in. I sensed someone inside the house, so I was sure my husband was home. I was a bit confused as to why he wasn't at work on a weekday, but I decided not to confront him about that or his absence from the hospital. My priority was introducing him to his son. I tried to keep a positive attitude, raising my voice a little as I cheerfully said, "I'm home," while entering the house. My husband appeared from the back and suddenly handed me something. "I've decided to marry my mistress, so hurry up and sign these divorce papers." "What's taken you so long to get discharged anyway?" He had been waiting for me to come back because he wanted the divorce as soon as possible. He was really irritated, telling me to sign right away, that I had no say in the matter, and that he never wanted a child to begin with. He even went so far as to say he didn't know what he might do to our son if I refused. But how could I agree to a divorce without understanding why? I couldn't accept his reasoning that he just wanted to marry his mistress. Divorce all of a sudden, our son was just born. Why? His attitude had been off ever since we found out I was pregnant. I knew something was up, but I never expected to be told we were getting divorced. And he's already got a mistress? Since when? It's your fault for not paying attention to me. You're my wife, right? You should have prioritized me over some unborn kid you weren't even sure would make it. This is on you. After I found out I was pregnant, I started having more and more days where I just didn't feel well. I had terrible morning sickness, and sometimes, even lying down didn't bring any relief. I had explained to my husband that this kind of thing happens during pregnancy and that I was one of those people who experience it. I was even told that my body was more prone to these symptoms than most. It's not like I was avoiding him on purpose. Not paying attention to him? Not being there for him? Even when I wasn't feeling well, I still made an effort to be mindful of him. And yet, he was out cheating, keeping a mistress on the side? What kind of joke is this? So, all those times he said he was busy with work or staying out overnight were just excuses to spend time with his mistress. Of course, I'm furious with him. But sometimes, when the anger is too overwhelming, you just end up feeling so shocked that you can't even say anything. It's a waste of time even trying to talk things over with a man like this. A man who acts like a selfish child, only thinking of himself? I'm better off throwing him away myself. I immediately signed the divorce papers and shoved them right back at him. But I still needed to inform his parents, who had been so kind to me. Especially since I had just been with his father a few minutes ago. When I called their house, my FIL hadn't returned home yet, so my MIL answered. My MIL, who had always been kind, suddenly said that my husband's cheating was my fault when I explained that it led to our divorce. If you had done your job as a wife properly, this wouldn't have happened. You probably used your pregnancy as an excuse to reject him, didn't you? Do you have any idea how hurtful that is for your husband? I never expected to hear something like that from my MIL, and I was so shocked I nearly dropped the phone. She went on to insult me, calling me a failure of a woman who couldn't satisfy her man, and said that the divorce was the right decision. She even said that since it was all my fault, I shouldn't get any share of the assets. But I was the victim here. I told my MIL that while I might not get the assets, I would still demand compensation. Later, my FIL stepped in and made sure I received the proper share of the assets. After that, I had to meet the mistress once to demand compensation from her as well. The mistress looked down on me completely, treating me like a discarded woman who had been kicked out of her rightful place. In my heart, I thought, you're bound to be replaced by another mistress and abandoned someday too. These things always have a way of coming back around. Apparently, after dropping me off, my FIL stopped somewhere else before heading home. If he hadn't stopped, he could have prevented my MIL's cruel words and given my husband a stern talking to. He apologized sincerely for not being able to help me and expressed genuine remorse. He promised that he'd make sure the money was paid in full. As a result, I got a message from my husband saying he'd pay all the alimony and child support in one lump sum. However, he added that once I received the money, I should never contact him again. I had no intention of reaching out to him either, as long as I got what was owed to me. Spending any more time on that awful man would just be a waste. After a while, my ex-husband deposited the alimony and child support in one lump sum, just as he said he would. Aside from the child support, my ex-husband showed no concern for our son at all. I got the sense that he had no interest in the child I had given birth to. I decided to return to my parents' house with my son. My parents were furious about the reason for the divorce, but out of respect for my FIL's sincerity, they gave up on confronting my ex-husband. 3 months later, I heard through the grapevine that my ex-husband had remarried his mistress. Since I had met my ex-husband through an acquaintance, I could learn about him through that network, but I never asked about him myself. With the help of my parents, my son was growing up healthy and strong. At that time, my son's well-being was my top priority, and nothing else mattered. Until, suddenly, someone completely unexpected appeared in front of me. 4 years later, it happened out of nowhere. I was living happily with my parents and my son. My father was still working, but on his days off, he often played with my son, which was a big help to me. By the time my son turned 4, his boundless energy became hard to keep up with. When I got tired, my father would take over, and when he was worn out, I'd step back in. My son would laugh at the sight of my father and me both exhausted. The moments when I saw my son growing up healthy were when I felt the happiest. That day, my parents had taken my son out, leaving me alone at home. My mother had told me I needed a break sometimes, and I gratefully accepted her advice that day. While I was relaxing, out of nowhere, my ex-husband's mistress showed up. It was suspicious, so I decided to talk to her through the intercom while secretly recording the conversation on my phone. At first, I intended to ignore her, but when the mistress started shouting, "Don't pretend you're not home, I know you're there," I had no choice but to respond. The only time I had met my ex-husband's mistress was when I demanded compensation during the divorce. It had been 4 years since then, and we hadn't had any contact. Why was she at my parents' house now? I told her I wouldn't listen to anything she had to say until she explained why she was here. Surprisingly, she admitted right away that she got my parents' address from my ex-FIL. I haven't been in touch with her either. What do you want after all this time? Your ex-husband died. I thought I'd let you know, just in case you started complaining about child support later. My ex-husband died? Well, people can die at any time, so it's not exactly shocking. But why would she come all the way to my parents' house to tell me something that could have been handled with a phone call? I felt suspicious about the mistress's actions. I see. So, he passed away. When did he die? What was the cause? Does it matter when? And as for the cause, he's dead, what difference does it make? Anyway, I came all the way here to collect a condolence payment, so hurry up and give me a decent amount. Excuse me? Why would I need to give a condolence payment for my ex-husband now? Is a condolence payment something you can even demand? I hesitated, saying I couldn't offer anything unless I knew the cause of death. But the mistress started changing her story, first saying it was a seizure, then a natural death. I don't have the death certificate on hand. It was some rare, complicated disease. How could it have been a natural death if it was some rare disease? I kept pressing her on when this all happened. My ex-husband was perfectly healthy 4 years ago, with no sign of any illness. Of course, sudden illnesses can happen, but the more I questioned my ex-husband's mistress, the more her story kept changing. Stop being so persistent. Just hand over the condolence money. If I don't bring it back, who knows what your MIL will say. The mistress kept insisting on the condolence money and even said that if she didn't bring it back, my ex-husband's mother would punish her. For a moment, I thought, yeah, that sounds like something she would do, but I still didn't feel comfortable giving her the money just because of that. Sorry, but the situation isn't clear, and besides, I haven't had any contact with my ex-husband since we divorced over your affair. Do you really think I'm obligated to give a condolence payment? Would you do the same if you were in my shoes? I kept my emotions in check and calmly expressed my stance, trying not to provoke her. But the mistress declared that she wouldn't leave until I handed over the condolence money. I checked the clock and realized it was almost time for my parents and son to come home. The thought of her staying until they got home and running into my parents or son made me shudder. More than anything, I was terrified of what she might do to my son. I asked the mistress if it was okay that I didn't have a proper envelope for the condolence money. She said she had one and just wanted the cash, so I pulled out 5 $100 bills from my wallet and gave them to her. I cracked the door open just enough to hand her the money, and she snatched it quickly, ready to leave. As she walked away, I told her that if she ever came back, I'd call the police. She didn't nod, but I could see her body tense up a bit. About 10 minutes after she left, my parents and son came home. I was deeply relieved that they didn't run into her. After that, I tried to forget the sudden incident as much as possible. But a year later, something completely unexpected happened. Because of my job, I often get calls from numbers that aren't saved in my phone. So, even if a call came from an unknown number, I'd usually answer as long as I wasn't busy. I thought this call was one of those, so I answered, even though the number didn't look familiar. On the other end, I heard a voice I recognized, saying, "Your ex-husband's funeral is starting. You need to be the head mourner. Come right now, understand?" The person sounded very flustered. I thought it might be my ex-FIL, and when she said, "Your ex-husband," I was sure it was her. But why a funeral? And why was I supposed to be the head mourner? Didn't my ex-husband die last year? The events from a year ago, which I had been trying to forget, suddenly came flooding back. A year ago, I had heard from my ex-husband's mistress that he had passed away, and I gave the condolence money to her who claimed they were sent by my MIL. I explained all of this to my ex-MIL. But my ex-MIL took my explanation as nothing more than an excuse to avoid being the head mourner and started yelling at me not to make up such lame stories. I realized that no matter what I said, she would only see it as me making more excuses to avoid being the head mourner. So, I decided to play her the recording of the conversation I had with the mistress. At first, my MIL kept shouting at me to hurry up and stop avoiding the issue, but as the recording played, she gradually grew quiet. Including that issue, just come to the funeral right now. Having recovered from her initial shock, my ex-MIL seemed determined to make sure I attended the funeral, even threatening to come get me if I refused. Just like with the mistress, I didn't want my ex-MIL to meet my parents or son, so I decided to head to the funeral home. I left my son with my parents and got ready to go to the funeral, but the more I thought about it, the stranger the whole situation seemed. Curious about what was really going on, I sped up and headed to the funeral home my former MIL had mentioned. When I arrived, my ex-MIL was having a loud, heated argument with the mistress outside the funeral home. The guests, who were waiting outside near the altar, could hear everything, and they exchanged puzzled looks, whispering among themselves. Before meeting with my MIL, I listened closely to the argument I could hear. How can you just pretend your husband's dead and then go begging for condolence money from the wife he left? Shut up. It's because he wasn't making enough money. I thought he'd be a better provider. I stole the wife's position, only to realize he wasn't worth it. I was tricked. Huh? Something doesn't seem to be adding up here. Then I overheard one of the guests, who had been listening to the argument from the beginning, explaining the situation to another guest. I started listening to them, too. Apparently, the mistress had racked up an enormous amount of debt and, unable to repay it, pretended my ex-husband was dead and came to me asking for condolence money. The money I had given as a condolence gift was used to pay off her debt. That's the real story. She must have been so desperate to pay off her debt that she had to come to me, someone she surely didn't want to see. My former MIL genuinely seemed unaware of this and started hurling insults at the mistress, calling her a greedy, money-hungry woman. But it seemed my ex-MIL had suspected all along that the mistress was greedy. I was against your marriage from the start. I never imagined you'd be so reckless with money, let alone rack up debt. From the moment she allowed their marriage, the mistress had been terrible with money. Apparently, the mistress had even been using the money my ex-MIL had been slowly saving up in a drawer. But the mistress had her own side of the story. If I'm greedy, then your son is a womanizing cheater. Why don't we tell everyone here the truth? He died in the middle of an affair. Regardless of how he died, isn't there a more dignified way to behave at an event like this? As I looked around in disbelief, I saw my former FIL, slumped in front of my ex-husband's casket, step in to try and mediate the lowbrow argument between his wife and the mistress. I wasn't sure how to approach him, but I couldn't just stand there, so I walked up to him, trailing off awkwardly as I said, "I'm sorry for your loss." One of the reasons I spoke to him was that I genuinely felt sorry for him. My former FIL was honestly surprised when I spoke to him. That's true. I was treated horribly by my ex-husband. It's no wonder my FIL is so shocked to see me here in mourning clothes when I wasn't even officially told about the funeral. I told my FIL everything he probably wanted to know. From the mistress showing up at my parents' house out of the blue a year ago to the call from his wife that brought me here today. After hearing all of this, my former FIL, who had been calmly mediating the fight between his wife and the mistress, began to look angry and raised his voice. Enough. How much trouble are you two going to put her through before you're satisfied? The mistress and his wife stopped fighting with each other and instead teamed up, closing in on me. They started shouting that everything was my fault, that I had caused all this trouble. When the mistress reached out to grab my shoulder, my ex-FIL stepped in front of me to shield me. "You two are the ones causing all the trouble. I just thought if we made the ex-wife take over for the woman who backed out as head mourner, it wouldn't be a problem. You were stuck when she cancelled at the last minute too. I get that it's inconvenient to be cancelled at the last minute, but she could have taken over herself." My former FIL, fed up with his wife's selfish and nonsensical reasoning, coldly told her that he wanted a divorce as soon as the funeral was over. My ex-MAL's attitude changed completely when she heard the word divorce. She suddenly switched to a sweet voice, begging her husband to reconsider. But he was resolute, and all she could do was hang her head in defeat. It seemed my ex-MAL always tended to act irrationally. Since she had never worked a day in her life, my ex-FIL had tried to correct her bad behavior while overlooking some of it. But it seemed all his efforts had been in vain. After seeing my former MIL hanging her head, I quietly left the funeral home. A few days later, I got a call from my former FIL saying he wanted to repay the money the mistress had tricked me out of. He could have just transferred the money, but since he had always treated me well, I thought it would be nice to see him one last time. According to him, after I left, all the guests found out about what had really happened. My ex-husband's secret affairs and the true circumstances of his death were exposed, and the funeral turned into a disaster. Instead of an atmosphere of mourning, it became an incredibly awkward and uncomfortable event. Most of the attendees at my ex-husband's funeral were my ex-FIL's associates, as he was well connected. The drama surrounding my former in-laws spread throughout the community in no time. Fortunately, my ex-FIL was well liked, and no one spoke badly of him. The main culprits in the in-law drama were my ex-MIL, the greedy, debt-ridden mistress, and my womanizing ex-husband, and so many people expressed sympathy for my ex-FIL. Even after all that, the mistress tried to stay at my in-law's house, so he had to kick her out. The mistress now has to work to repay her debts and survive, but the rumors about her mistakes are making it difficult for her to find a job. That's all her own doing. She's getting what she deserves. I thought it had nothing to do with me, until one day, the mistress showed up for an interview at my workplace. When I returned to my parents' house and was looking for a new job, I had hoped to find something close to home, but it wasn't easy to find the right opportunity. Following my parents' advice, I expanded my job search area, and eventually found a position. That's why I'm currently working somewhere a bit far from my parents' house. Since this area has no connection to my family or my in-laws, I never expected to run into anyone I knew. I assumed the mistress had run into some issues and had ended up here while looking for a job in another area. Currently, I'm working at a regional bank. I used to work at a major bank, but I quit when I got married. When I was looking for a new job, I initially wanted to avoid working at a bank. The reason was that, in banking, work doesn't end until problems are resolved. And even with my parents' help, I felt bad for my young son. I wanted to prioritize my son until he at least finished elementary school. In the end, since it was tough to find a job as a woman returning to the workforce, I followed my parents' advice to focus on positions where I had experience, and that led me back to banking. Bank job interviews are particularly tough, unlike those in other industries. Of course, that's understandable given that we handle people's money. I happened to know that the interviewer and my direct supervisor were former colleagues, so I subtly mentioned something to my supervisor. I told him about her past with the condolence money scam and her financial irresponsibility, including her debts. Naturally, even bankers take out loans. While loans are a form of debt, the mistress's debts were purely for her own selfish desires. The issue was that her debts far exceeded her ability to repay them. My supervisor took the condolence money scam very seriously, and he passed it along to the interviewer. The mistress was rejected for the job right before her interview. On her way out, she happened to run into me. Since I was working, it was hard to avoid her. I thought she wouldn't cause a scene in front of customers, but I was wrong. As soon as she noticed me, she marched straight toward me. She shouted, "This is your fault," and grabbed me by the collar. A nearby customer screamed, and some male employees rushed over to pull us apart, while someone yelled to call security. When security arrived, the mistress couldn't resist and was thrown out of the building. My supervisor asked if I wanted to file a police report, but I declined, thinking I wouldn't have to deal with her again. He was concerned that I might be targeted on my way to or from work, even though we have security guards on site. I reassured him that I'd be fine, but a few days later, I realized just how naive I had been. While I was at work, I got a call from the police. Apparently, the mistress had told the police where I worked. I tried to tell the officer that I had nothing to do with the mistress and was about to hang up. But when I heard what the officer said next, I couldn't believe my ears. The mistress and my ex-FIL had teamed up and broken into my parents' old house, attempting to steal valuables. If that's the case, my mother, who's watching the house, should have called me. Why was the police contacting me instead? Why had the mistress specifically mentioned my workplace to the police? I asked the officer to confirm the address of the house where the break-in happened. It turns out they had broken into my family's old home. After the mistress pulled her condolence scam, my parents prioritized our safety and quickly moved to a different location. Our old home was in a prime location and sold quickly, so someone else should be living there now. Not knowing that, the mistress and my ex-FIL broke in, intending to rob the place. I can't imagine how shocked the current residents must have been. The residents immediately called the police, and the two were caught red-handed and taken into custody. Thanks to the residents' quick actions, they weren't able to steal anything. Normally, they could still be punished for attempted robbery. However, the residents chose not to press charges since they weren't the intended targets. In the end, the mistress and my ex-FIL only received a stern warning from the police, but they needed someone to act as a guarantor to release them. They decided to name me as their guarantor, stating they didn't know where I lived but knew where I worked, which is why the police contacted me. How could they have the audacity to ask me to be their guarantor? The nerve of these people is just unbelievable. I told the police that I was divorced and had no connection to my former ex-FIL. I also made it clear that the mistress was someone I despised and not even family, then I hung up. The thought of what could have happened if my parents hadn't moved still gives me chills. I glanced at the clock and realized my son would be home from preschool, spending time with my mom. I couldn't stop shaking, and my concerned supervisor suggested I leave early and take some time to rest. The mistress and my ex-FIL had caused so much chaos, but they were both facing the consequences of their actions. My ex-FIL was left alone in the house, as her husband had moved out, leaving her the home and land. Despite her irrational behavior, she seemed overly concerned about what others thought of her. The rumors about my ex-husband's affairs and her attempted theft caused her to become a recluse. She began to see everyone as an enemy, convinced that people were bad-mouthing her. The family had lived in that house for generations, so they had long-standing ties with the neighbors. The shutters on the house stayed closed, the garden was overgrown, and no one answered when the doorbell rang. Eventually, a concerned neighbor reported it to the authorities, and they came to check on her. They found my ex-FIL, emaciated and frail, looking like a skeleton. She was muttering incoherently, so they determined it was no longer possible for her to live in the house. She was placed in a facility after that, but no one knows if she's still alive. As for the mistress, she continued looking for a job nearby for a while. However, once it became known that she was involved in a police incident, her job search became even more difficult. She apparently moved to another area to start fresh, but quickly ran out of money, accumulating more debt. Since she didn't have any guarantors, she borrowed from some shady people and eventually disappeared without a trace. I've heard that these questionable people are now searching for her. If even they can't find her, there's a chance she might still be surviving somewhere. My ex-FIL had married into the family as a son-in-law. My ex-FIL was an only child, set to inherit the family estate, but she was so naive that they brought in my ex-FIL, who was more grounded. Yet even my ex-FIL's steady personality couldn't correct my MIL's behavior. My ex-FIL has since returned to the place where he grew up and is now enjoying the life he might have wanted had he not married into the family. He cares a lot about my son, so I send him updates a few times a year. He only replies with a Christmas card, but from his words, I can tell he's enjoying a fulfilling second life. This whole ordeal has caused my parents a lot of trouble. So, I've vowed to work hard and take care of my parents in their old age. My parents told me not to worry about them and suggested that I remarry if I meet someone nice. Sometimes I feel guilty that my son is growing up without a father's love. But no one knows what the future holds. I've decided not to view these events as a stain on my life, but rather as necessary experiences. I'm committed to living fully in the present. The future is limitless, and the uncertainty of what's to come is what makes life exciting. I want to teach my son that life isn't predetermined, and that he has plenty of options. I vowed to focus even more on my son and to make our family of 4 even happier.